feel free to applaud. This is how we start our programs, with the beautiful clock and the lighting effect. Welcome to the Massachusetts Historical Society. Thank you for joining us tonight and attending a very important program. Tonight's program is just one of many featuring luminaries and experts. If you are new to us, please know that in addition to our wonderful public programs, we have so much to offer you, including exhibitions that are free and open to the public year-round, and the opportunity to access our primary source materials, and research seminars that take deep dives into relevant topics regarding the MHS collections. I am grateful to you all for being here, and to our sponsors for supporting programs like this one. And I do want to take a moment and thank our signature sponsors, Kasner and Edwards, and First Republic Bank, as well as our premier sponsor, M&T Bank. In a moment, you're going to hear from M&T's Regional President, Grace Lee, who will talk about why programs like this one are meaningful to M&T Bank, and she will introduce our distinguished speakers. So, this is Grace Lee. She has more than 25 years of public and private sector leadership experience in Massachusetts. As Regional President, Grace is responsible for M&T's strategic development and growth through its community banking activities. Prior to her banking career, Grace was General Counsel and First Deputy Treasurer of the State Treasury. Notably, while at the Treasury, Grace was instrumental in the passage of the legislation that established the Asian American Commission and served as the Commission's first executive treasurer. I love lawyers, I got to tell you that. I have so many on my board and I love them, and I'm happy to tell you that before joining the Treasury, Grace was an attorney at Morgan, Brown, and Joy, where she concentrated on employment discrimination, labor law, and commercial litigation. So please join me in welcoming Grace Lee.
So, thank you, Catherine. So thank you very much for giving me a couple of minutes. M&T is new to the market. Our team isn't new to the market, but one of the things that I'm incredibly proud of is M&T's legacy of community banking and commitment. One of the aspects of that is making sure as an organization we meet all of our customers where they are, not where we are. And in these very troubling times, I think it's very important that every entity, every organization reflects and kind of identifies how we can contribute to making this world better, more equitable, and more just. And financial institutions play a key role in this endeavor. I think one of the things the pandemic has highlighted is that all things being equal, people that had more resources did better. That's point blank. That's before you get into the systemic racism, anything, before you even contemplate anything. Those that had more did better. As a financial institution, we bear a responsibility to making sure that the knowledge that we have, and you know, I say this and people always kind of act as if it's an epiphany. You know, they think that banks and financial institutions are cold and transactional, but this is a topic, when you talk about money, there's nothing more personal than money. You want to trigger somebody, start asking about their personal finances, right? Money represents privilege, access, resources, oppression, everything. So when you talk about the role of a financial institution, you have to start at that level and then recognize where our customers are, and if we need to get culturally competent, we should. If we need to get more financially fluent on their level, we should. If we need to make sure that they are at a level that we can connect with, and we are at a level that we can connect with them, then we must, which is why I'm so incredibly proud to be introducing this presentation today. This evening is is a very powerful and timely presentation. Donald Yacovone's new book, Teaching White Supremacy, is a look at our educational system. And I told him to, abbreviate my bio, but I started in civil rights as an attorney, chief of the Civil Rights Division in the DA's office, and at the Office of Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Education. So, when this opportunity arose, I have to say that I was completely inspired, and what Mr. Yacovone's work does, it highlights the educational system, the textbooks that our children read, review, and he looks at the context of how it reinforces the racial superiority of whites in America in a context that starts from primary school all the way up through our entire academic institution. In preparing to publish this book, Mr. Yacovone reviewed 3,000 textbooks. That's very impressive. He studied 250 textbooks that were written between 1830 and the 1980s. What he discovered, and not surprisingly to this group, is that there was a consistent pattern of emphasis of white supremacy. He currently is a lifetime associate at Harvard University, Hutchins Center for African American Research. He is an author and or editor of 11 books, the winner of an NAACP Image Award for the African American Many Rivers to Cross, and a recipient of the W.E.B. Du Bois Medal from Harvard University. He's also a former staff member of the Massachusetts Historical Society and a longtime friend to the organization. Mr. Yacovone will start with a brief conversation and review of his book, and then we'll continue with a conversation with his colleague, and, I say he's like a movie star, Henry Louis Gates Jr. I know, I said, I know you, I see you on TV all the time. And so, and I feel like, this talk about an abbreviated bio for someone. Dr. Gates is an Alphonse Fletcher University professor, director of the Hutchins Center of African and African American Research in Harvard University. He's an Emmy and Peabody Award-winning filmmaker, a literary scholar, a journalist, and a cultural critic. His most recent project, the documentary series Making Black America, is currently airing on PBC. He serves on the board of advisory of the Massachusetts Historical Society and is a really good friend of the organization. And like I said, general overall superstar. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Yacovone and Dr. Gates.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you for those online, and I especially want to thank Charlotte Sheedy, without whom none of this would have happened. Could we put up, thank you. This 1873 lithograph, variously entitled American Progress or Manifest Destiny, by the New York publisher and Western travel promoter, George A. Crofut, exalts the divine mission of the United States to expand across the continent. The illustration's alluring figure of Columbia with the Star of Empire on her forehead floats across the landscape, sweeping away indigenous peoples and the wilderness for the expansion of American farms, cities, and railroads. Her left hand clutches a telegraph line, the internet of the 19th century. In her right cradles not the Bible or a digest of laws, but as Crofut wrote, quote, the emblem of education, the school book. Never before or since has any American more graphically unified national identity with white supremacy and education. I did not set out to write teaching white supremacy. I had been writing a different book, but my encounter with the invaluable collection of about 3,000 history textbooks at the Harvard Graduate School of Education's Monroe C. Gutman Library compelled me to change. Not a book about a bunch of bad books. Instead, this is an exploration of the origins, development, and perpetuation of the idea of American national identity as white from the colonial era to the present. If nothing else, it focuses on the responsibility of Northern cultural leaders and educators for the creation and dissemination of white supremacy and construction of the color line. Traditionally, both scholarship and popular thought have blamed the legacy of Southern slavery for the distressing persistence of racial inequality. And of course, Southern slave owners and their descendants do possess a unique and lethal responsibility for racial repression and civil war. But even if slaves had never existed in the South, Northern white religious leaders, intellectuals, writers, politicians, scientists, educators, and lawyers would have invented a lesser race, which is exactly what happened, to build white democratic solidarity, and in that way make democratic culture and political institutions possible. As the novelist Toni Morrison once explained, in the United States, the rights of man was inevitably yoked to Africanism. In other words, American democracy depended upon black inequality to sustain white equality. The Reverend Henry M. Field, brother of the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Stephen J. Field, who helped decide the landmark 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson case that nationalized Jim Crow segregation, had been born in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. The so-called color line, he explained in 1890, is not peculiar to one section of the country. It exists at the North as well as the South. It would be a mistake, he warned, to, and these are his words, ascribe what we call race prejudice to the peculiar perversity of our Southern brethren. Although Reverend Field had been raised by the formerly enslaved Elizabeth Freeman, also known as Mumbet, who had initiated a landmark legal case to win her own freedom and help end slavery in Massachusetts, he felt powerless to reject racism. Such sentiments, he held, were, quote, a matter of instinct, which is often wiser than reason. We cannot fight against instinct, he explained, nor legislate against it. If we do, we shall find it stronger than our resolutions and our laws. Such instincts always had infused public education. James Baldwin, the celebrated African-American author and critic, recalled in 1965 that, quote, I was taught in American history books that Africa had no history, and that neither had I. I was a savage about whom the least said the better, who had been saved by Europe and who had been brought to America. This was, his education taught him, quote, an act of God. You belonged where white people put you. And it always had been so. In the 1920s, if an African-American student had asked a teacher why no black people appeared in his textbook, the answer would be that African-Americans, quote, had done nothing to merit inclusion. As the black scholar Charles H. Wesley reported in 1925, through textbooks and classroom instruction, the black student quickly realized, quote, that his badge of color in America was a sign of subjugation, inferiority, and contempt. In 1939, the NAACP surveyed popular American history textbooks, and as one black student concluded from the association's findings, since textbooks drilled white supremacy, quote, into the minds of growing children, I see how hate and disgust is motivated against the American Negro. Textbooks became cultural syringes that injected these poisons directly into the minds of American students, black and white. In part, we are right to see history textbooks as prayer books of our national civil religion, as engines of democracy and equality, to forge national identity and unity. But what was the nature of that unity textbooks aimed to create? The overwhelming majority of American textbooks began with the assumption that the history of the United States was the history of the white man. His struggles against Native Americans, who they usually called red savages, their intolerable efforts to destroy, quote, the superior race, and his need to control the lives of African Americans. As the 1918 text explained to students, whatever non-English people had done to create the United States, quote, and italicized, the forces that have shaped that life have been English. Emerson had long before worshipped that view in his 1856 book, English Traits. Most textbooks variously presented African Americans as a foreign, repellent element, an unwanted presence, a necessary evil, or a threat, and always, as one 1914 textbook asserted, quote, a problem that it took many years to solve. Thomas Maitland Marshall's 1930 textbook embodied the ideals, assumptions, and aims cherished by most American history textbooks, published before 1970. The very first page shrieks in capital letters, right under the title, Chapter 1, The Story of the White Man. As so many other 20th century textbooks inculcated, Marshall taught, quote, that the Negro of plantation days was usually happy. He was fond of the company of others and liked to sing, dance, crack jokes, and laugh. He admired bright colors and was proud to wear a red or orange bandana. Oh, he was never in a hurry and was always ready to let things go until the morrow. Many planters, he asserted, learned that loyalty based on pride, kindness, and rewards, even wine, not the whip, brought the best returns. American children learned that during Reconstruction, Negroes were unfit to rule. It had been a terrible mistake, 20th century textbooks proclaimed, well into the 1960s and 70s, to prevent the intelligent white people from governing after the Civil War. Authors assured readers that, quote, men of intelligence and property will not submit to the rule of the ignorant very long. And of course, by ignorant, he meant African Americans. As Professor Marshall had concluded, quote, white robes and fiery crosses had the desired results. While the worst features of our textbooks have been eliminated, the problem that James Baldwin had identified in the 1960s remains. Teachers from Florida to Vermont and west to the state of Washington staged damaging slave auctions in their classrooms, what one black Vermont parent rightly labeled curricular violence. The influential New York Times journalist Charles Blow explained that when he was young, I was led to believe blackness was inferior. We had been trained in it, bathed in it, acculturated to hate ourselves. At every turn, at every moment, I was being baptized in the narrative that everything white was right, good, noble, and beautiful, and everything black was not. The bitter influence lay everywhere, he wrote, even in the blue-eyed white Jesus hanging over your bed. The experience of black high school students in my own Boston suburb in 2020 reinforces Blow's account. I am not going to lie, one female student exclaimed. Going to high school made me hate being black. Despite the monumental outburst of thoughtful and determined scholarship since the 1960s, the way we teach history in the public schools remains as lifeless as John Brown's body. But clearly, slavery and race isn't in the past, it's in the headlines. However taught in schools, history is far from a dead thing. We carry it with us, James Baldwin memorably remarked in his essay, The White Man's Guilt. We are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, he wrote, since it is to history that we owe our frame of reference, our identities, and our aspirations.
Thank you, Donald. That was marvelous. I want to say, because we have a new arrivant on campus at Harvard here, I don't want you to leave without seeing Phyllis Wheatley's desk. Phyllis, I always loved this place for so many reasons, but the fact that Phyllis Wheatley, the very first person of African descent to publish a book of poetry in English, wrote on a desk that's here. And you can see it before you leave. And if you don't, you get an F in my course, so you got it. Second generation Harvard woman, so you can't beat that. And Nina Dayton, where's Nina? And no, Nina Dayton, yeah, the other one. And, you know, with Phyllis Wheatley, it's very much on my mind because I'm doing a review essay on Phyllis Wheatley. And the 250th anniversary of the publication of her book is next September 1st. And we knew a lot about Phyllis Wheatley, but for the last 4 years of her life, just sort of disappeared. And Greg, we just presumed nobody knew. You know, she died a horrible death in poverty and misery. But you always have to keep looking. And that woman right there uncovered those last lost 4 years of Phyllis Wheatley's life. So give it up for Professor Nina Dayton. So Donald, what was the thread that you pulled on in the archives that led to this book, a marvelous book, which I blurbed, David Blight blurbed, Teaching White Supremacy? How did a nice white guy like you?
Well, I think the way to answer this is to explain how I came about doing this. Mm-hmm. I was writing a different book, as I alluded to in my comments, and I decided to take a break from this enormous manuscript collection I was looking at the Houghton Library, and I thought, well, the large theme I was researching at the time was the public memory, the anti-slavery movement, and its influence on creating the civil rights movement. And so I thought, well, I've been spending about 3 months going through the John J. Chapman papers, and I need a break, 55 boxes. And I went over to the Gutman Library, and I thought, well, I'll look at a couple textbooks to see what they said about the abolitionist movement. And I was confronted by this collection of 3,000 textbooks, which I had no clue was there. And I have to say, I was staggered. I didn't know what to do. And I decided that, well, I have to look at something here. I pulled out, just turned out to be, a textbook by Noah Webster, published in 1832, the year after Garrison's emergence. And
So that's William Lloyd Garrison, who founded the Liberator here in Boston in 1831.
Yep. And I was astonished why, I'm not sure. I mean, I had read, of course, all the historiography. I knew what historians had written about race and all. But I'd never spent any time looking at textbooks. Why would I, to do original research? You don't rely on textbooks. And I was just shocked by the overt emphasis on whiteness in these books. And the more I read, the more obvious they became. And in fact, now there's a break after Reconstruction in 1870 and 1880s, but for the most part, the more closer I get to modern times, the more overt the white supremacy became, until that one I quoted in 1930 was, I mean, right on the front page, the story of the white man. And this became just a dominant theme. It was so overwhelming to me that I had to stop the project I was doing. And it was like a force descended on me and said, Donald, you have to do this. Now, this was before Trump was elected president. I didn't have any political motives to do this, and I had no inkling that there would be any public interest in it. I was just astonished at what I was finding. And I kept at it. Well, after I went through all these textbooks, I decided that, well, you know, I don't want to write a book about a bunch of bad books. What the, you know, who wants to read that? So I said, well, I have to explain to the reader where all this came from. Why is it here? Why is it so fundamental to the way Americans understood their own history, understood their own identity, and their, you know, and what they wanted to pass on to future generations? Well, so the first 2 chapters in the book explain the importance of white supremacy, how it developed, various aspects, who developed it, and that's essentially the second chapter on John H. Van Every, who is the first professional racist in the United States, made his living as a racist, created a publishing empire in the middle of Manhattan, published many books, pamphlets, 2 newspapers, a weekly and a monthly, and had his work quoted in Congress. Lincoln read it. Representatives in state legislatures read his stuff to their colleagues. Nobody's ever heard of him. Well, let me just read you this little quote. It's by Horace Mann, who many of you probably have heard of, the kind of father of public education and teacher training. When the teacher fails to meet the intellectual wants of a child, it is the case of asking for bread and receiving a stone. But when he fails to meet its moral wants, it is giving a serpent. I imagined this book before I started writing it and had all the notes and ready to go. Chapters 1 and 2 are the head of that serpent, the brains. Chapters 3 through 8 are the body of the serpent. The epilogue is the tail, which brings the story up to the present. And the textbooks are the spinal cord of that serpent. And the first one I mention, it was written by John H. Van Every and his partner, Rushmore Horton, to justify white supremacy and denigrate abolitionism and Abraham Lincoln.
What's it like to, just as a writer, you know, when I'm writing, I'm following a passion. I'm excited about something, discovering something or synthesizing, you know, ideas that are out there, but people haven't really put them together in the right way, and that drives my passion. But what's it like to be horrified into a project, as opposed to being inspired by a figure such as our very own abolitionist Wendell Phillips, about whom you've written so passionately? I mean, did you wake up and say, I'm going to kick another white supremacist?
No. I was, however, fascinated by the, I don't want to say evil, but I was fascinated by the imagination of Van Every. Because he wasn't filled with hate. You would have expected someone like that to be a manifestation of hate, but it wasn't. He had been trained as a doctor. gave it up after the Mexican War. In fact, his wife died after the Mexican War, and he even abandoned his own child to the family, so he could take up his mission to sustain white supremacy in the United States and to ward off what he saw as the British mission to destroy American democracy, which he identified as white democracy. He didn't hate African Americans, which was so fascinating to me. However, he defined them as a species, a separate species of man, and he explained it very logically in his pamphlets and his books, that just like there are different species of animals, there are different species of men.
David Hume did that in 1753.
Yeah.
Immanuel Kant in 1764. It's a very old idea in
Yeah.
the body of Western philosophy.
And he drew on that. Since he doesn't have a collection of papers, I don't know who he read, except those people he mentions, and he mentions Hume in his books. So anyway, and one of the more important elements of his argument was the necessity, as Toni Morrison had mentioned later, much later, that American democracy would not exist without the African American presence. Now, this is what to us is an unusual statement, because so many Northerners during this period in the 19th century, before the Civil War, were interested in the American Colonization Society. They didn't care if there were people of African descent in the South. That was their problem, not our problem. But if there were people of African descent in the North, it's best we get rid of them. Well, he didn't take that approach. In fact, his approach was exactly the opposite. In fact, he described American culture and the African presence as like being two boys on a seesaw. They were necessary for balance. They were essential to the success of America. Now, this idea ripples throughout American history, and I found later when I was doing my work, I read a 1954 study by Gordon Allport, a Harvard psychology professor, and in his massive text, he had interviewed a lot of people to do this, to assess American racial attitudes in the 1950s. And he interviewed a 5-year-old girl. And the girl was upset because the only black family in town was leaving. And he was kind of shocked by that. Well, why are you upset that they're leaving? And she said, now there'll be no one who we're better than. A 5-year-old. She wasn't even in school yet she was already immersed in white supremacy and the necessity of a black presence to build white racial solidarity.
So when do you trace the origins of the use of school books to, schools, we learn how to be citizens in schools. I pledge allegiance to the flag, my country 'tis of thee, all that, it just automatically, when I hear that, my hand goes over my heart, I do that, because that's the way we were trained, right? I started first grade in 1956. First thing we did was I pledge allegiance to the flag. America the beautiful, all of that stuff. Listening to you reminded me of Bryan Stevenson's famous quote, that the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war. So Donald, in retrospect, who won the Civil War?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm glad you said that, because at the end of the war, the famous abolitionist you already mentioned, Wendell Phillips, wanted to remind the North wanted to remind the North that, yes, slavery was dead, but the master remains. It was a warning. Textbooks said, slavery is dead, but the Negro remains.
You said that there was a gap, if I understood you correctly, about 1870, which is Reconstruction,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Reconstruction
Yep.
officially,
Yep.
ladies and gentlemen, is well, scholars disagree, but you could say 1866 to, or 1865 to 1876 with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise. So, was there a time when, see, he moved it and got an echo in here. I knew where it was supposed to be, but was there a time when the narrative of American history in textbooks was something that we would applaud?
Oh, very much so. It wasn't very long, but it was, and it lasted longer than I ever imagined.
Tell us about
Yeah. So there is one particular author. Well, I should back up that before the Civil War, there were textbooks that criticized slavery in the 1830s. By the time we get into the 1840s, those very same textbooks were purged of that criticism. And the closer we get into the controversial 1850s, the more purging took place. Then after the Civil War, of course, there's a delay. It takes time to write a book. But what I noticed, what I could see in these new books coming out, was an attempt to grapple with the meaning of the Civil War and how to translate that into American history. What does American history mean now after this terrible crisis that had killed at least 750,000 people? And I could see the gradual transformation and new people coming to write textbooks. One in particular, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who, one of the John Brown's Secret Six, wrote a fascinating textbook that was unlike what had come before the war. Before the war, and textbooks by and large were painfully similar. European exploration, European colonization, revolution, Constitution, and every successive presidential administration. History did not take place outside of that formula. And every paragraph of every book was numbered. Well, some of these things were even painful for me to read, and I stumbled across one textbook published actually after the Civil War that the owner had stabbed with either a nail or an awl or something, or maybe with a low caliber rifle, shot it, because it went through the cover, which was thick, and halfway through the book. Really disturbing.
I
but-
felt that way about classes.
Yeah, exactly. So it didn't surprise me in the least. I'm surprised I didn't find more of them like that. But once we get to after the Civil War, there's an obvious struggle to bring the meaning of America into view. And what we're seeing, and as I said, new people like Higginson, and in particular, and this will be of local interest, Charles Carlton Coffin. Coffin had been the most famous Civil War reporter, period. His on the scene reports of battles, I mean, he was there. He didn't go to the general's tent to find out what happened. He was on scene. There are accounts of him running across the battlefield trying to get the full story. And he also published his reporting in a separate, collected them on a separate book, big fat thing about 500 pages. fascinating reading. But he decided to write a textbook, or textbooks, actually. It's this whole series of textbooks, which were enormously popular here in Boston. The Boston Public Library had 45 copies of his books, and they were always all checked out. He saw, as no one had written before, true American democracy suddenly now becoming a reality. That it was an effort that stretched back to pre-colonization Europe, an attempt to bring to have liberty flourish, and then bring that liberty to the colonies and have it grow. And the Civil War he interpreted as a major event in bringing liberty to all, for all in the United States. That never happened in any of the textbooks prior to the war. And so he and other writers like Elisha Mulford, who I talk about, and again, no one's ever heard of him, who had a distinctly, what we would see as a distinctly modern interpretation of not just American history, but of the American nation, which was the title of his book.
Were they aware of how radical the Reconstruction amendments were?
Oh, absolutely.
13th, 14th,
Oh,
and
sure.
15th
Yeah,
Amendments?
because they all knew about the Southern reaction to those and the unrelenting murder that was taking place in Southern
To remind
cities.
you, I'm sure you don't need to be reminded, but the 13th Amendment is what? The Emancipation Proclamation did not abolish slavery. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment established the Equal Protection Clause and made African American citizens. And remember the Dred Scott decision that said that the founders never had citizenship in mind for African Americans, that they were never, ever included in all men were created equal, et cetera, et cetera. And then the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, gave black men the right to vote. However, black men in the South had received, which were 90% of all black men lived in the former Confederacy. Right. They were given the right to vote because of the Reconstruction Acts. Yep. So black men in the South got the right to vote in the summer of 1867. In the North, free black men could only vote in 5 of the 6 New England states, not in Connecticut, right, and in the state of New York, if you could satisfy a $250 property requirement up to the Civil War. So we think of the liberal North, where slavery was abolished, right, as a place of equality, and it just wasn't that way.
Yeah, and Connecticut even rejected black voting during the war.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm interested in this tension which you suggested between writing about the evils of slavery, but still thinking black people were subhuman. Frederick Douglass famously said in 1856 that one could be anti-slavery and still hate the slaves. And to paraphrase, he said, the only thing certain abolitionists in the North hated more than slavery was the slave, because they thought black people were inherently substandard, a subspecies of the human community. Did you find that tension?
Absolutely, and there is this tension, but they're not engaged. The textbooks don't engage one another. They exist simultaneously, and they get used in various places. I even found that Van Every's textbook was used where? Boston. Where else, I don't know. But to emphasize the theme that I've been developing in the book about Northern responsibility, and to pick up on what Skip has just said, I want to emphasize the career of James Shepard Pike, who probably is the single most important individual in helping to end Reconstruction. A Northerner from where? Maine. Gets pretty far north in Maine. He was a rabid Republican during the 1850s, hated the Democratic Party, which was the essence of white racial supremacy, fair to say, supported the South then. And he joined the Lincoln administration and was a diplomat. Well, after, and of course hated slavery, but as Skip pointed out, wasn't too fond of African Americans either. And he published a book called The Prostate State, which was about South Carolina.
Right.
And this book, which was reviewed all over the North, became a powerful argument to reverse all the amendments that Skip was talking about, the very idea of white racial equality, and of course black voting was just a ridiculous idea. He said in his book, The Prostate State, that when the black legislators in South Carolina rose to speak, he said they didn't know what they were going to say before they said it. They didn't know what they were saying while they were saying it, and they had no idea what they had said after they sat down.
Right. South Carolina is a footnote. The South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana were majority black states.
Yeah.
This is like astonishing to think about. And Florida, Alabama, and Georgia were almost majority black states. Their black population was in the 40%. South Carolina was ground zero for black power during Reconstruction. They had, after the 1868 election, remember black men got the right to vote in 1867, and remember only men had the right to vote. The House of Representatives, majority black. Secretary of the Treasury was black. Speaker of the House was black. I mean, it was astonishing. And that was too much black power. So there was a whole apparatus that arose to say that these men were incompetent. And how many of you have seen Birth of a Nation? Remember you saw Birth of a Nation? That scene in the legislature of South Carolina, that is the parody of black electoral power under Reconstruction. When black men are drinking, eating chicken wings, and they jump up and celebrate, and remember it's a silent film, the caption says, miscegenation has been passed so they could sleep with white women. I mean, it was horrible. And Pike's book was a prelude to the popularization of
yeah, and as I said, it was reviewed across the North, and abolitionists supported it. In fact, one of them from Boston went to South Carolina to see if what Pike had written was really true, and they said, the people I spoke to, who knows who we spoke to, affirmed everything that Pike had written.
And remember how controversial this was. Lincoln, it could be said, was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth because he announced in his last speech at the White House that he was going to give, not all black men, only certain black men, his black warriors,
The soldiers, yeah.
the 200,000 black men who had served in the Army and the Navy, and the very intelligent Negroes. It was probably Frederick Douglass, right? That he was going to give them the right to vote. So this is, let's say, 210,000 black men would have been given the right to vote by Abraham Lincoln, and there were, in the 1860 census, there were 4.4 million African Americans. So let's say half of them were men. So it wasn't such a radical claim, except it was for John Wilkes Booth. And John Wilkes Booth reportedly turned to the person next to him. He was standing on the grounds of the White House when Lincoln made this speech and said, "That's it, I'm going to run him through." And a few days later, he killed him. Yeah. So, but what have you, well, let me ask you about the present. We're living in an era when parents are fiercely contesting what's being taught in our nation's schools about American history, and especially the history of slavery and the history of race. And one of my books, I can't believe it, one of my books was just banned in Texas. And it wasn't one that I would have banned if I had been on the right. You know what I mean? I mean, I've written some incendiary things. They banned a chronology grade. It is a simple annotated list of dates, starting with the first black man to set foot in Florida, Juan Garrido, who was a free black man, a conquistador, and it went on to Barack's election. I mean, I don't even think they read it. They They ban it. It's ridiculous. But where would you say we are in the longer story of fighting for a more perfect history, as it were, of our more perfect union?
Every time I talk about the book to the public, this comes up, and it's for obvious reasons. It's what our current crisis is dealing with.
He said we should move to questions from the audience. I got more questions. No, I just did that to make my buddy Greg laugh. I haven't seen it. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. It's so revealing of white anxiety. That's why I spent so much time quoting James Baldwin about identity and its meaning, and how much acknowledgement of the diversity of American society threatens people, about, 45% of the nation, just turns them inside out and upside down. They can't tolerate it because their very beings is being overturned, or how they see it.
But why would they see it that way, rather than seeing it as democracy achieving its full potential?
Well, I've often thought of this because for 150 years, children repeat the Pledge of Allegiance, repeat the Pledge of Allegiance that ends with liberty and justice for all. It's like, well, don't you remember what you've been saying every morning? Apparently not. The overwhelmingness of this, what is perceived as a challenge to identity, just overwhelms every other consideration.
Donald, but to what extent do you think, or do you think to any extent, this tendency to censorship, this rise of white supremacy in different forms, is a reaction, or let me put it this way, to what extent does this rollback map onto the larger redemption story after the election of the first black president?
Yeah, well, as Jill Lepore had written, his election, to many people, seemed to have torn a hole in the fabric of time. And I think that's exactly how people perceived it. Some people perceived it. And I think that the challenge to everything that they understand and their power is intolerable. Now, as far as textbooks are concerned, I looked at many modern ones, and they don't have the horridness of some of the stuff that I read to you, and it is a lot worse, trust me. But if you won't teach it, what does it matter? And I found back in the 1980s when I was teaching in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and I asked high school teachers, what do you teach in American history? And they said, quote, "We don't," unquote. We don't. That's going on now. I lecture to students and I ask them, well, what did you learn when you were in high school about African American history and slavery? And the answer was, quote, "Not much," unquote. As the Southern Poverty Law Center discovered when they interviewed hundreds of teachers, they're afraid to teach it. And now it's gotten even worse because you could lose your job for doing it.
Absolutely.
So this is a current crisis, an ongoing current crisis, which is apt to get worse before it gets better.
Well, but your book,
Thank you so much. I hate to end on crisis, but part of what we do here.
I'm actually not finished, but I will be in 1 second.
Okay.
And your book is a timely intervention in this debate that's going on in state legislature. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to give it up for Donald for what he's done. now we'd like to welcome questions from the floor.
Oh, thank you. I learned a lot. Were there any people during the time when these publications came out, especially in, let's say, the 19th, early 20th century, that there were either comments or criticisms about the portrayal of white supremacy?
No, is the short answer. If you mean like and as I said earlier, the further we get into the modern era, the more intense this material became, the more obvious, the more detailed, the more outrageous from our own modern standards it became. And I never saw any criticism of it at all. Now, there were competing texts, a few that were published in the late 19th century. Some of them survived into the early 20th century, but by the time we get to about 1911, they are simply overwhelmed by hundreds and hundreds of other textbooks. I mean, the Harvard collection of 3,000, I mean, there are thousands more. Yeah. No, I didn't find any objection to what I was reading in those textbooks. Yeah, none. Now, except what I mentioned, the NAACP and other groups that did look at them and were justifiably outraged. Yeah.
Next question?
Well, I wanted to make
In the microphone.
Okay, I just wanted to make a comment. It's ironic that the Africans that were elected to political office in the South were making laws that made life better for the white people.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And nobody acknowledges that.
Take public schools.
Yeah.
Public schools didn't exist in the South. They were a result of the integrated legislatures elected during Reconstruction.
Right.
So
Yeah.
there were many good things done by those Reconstruction legislatures.
And I just want to say I've been a history teacher in Lawrence for 20 years, 21 years. And about 15 or 16 years ago, I realized that I was teaching my students lies. I stopped using textbooks. And I bring in primary sources, and we talk about it. And one of the songs I use is Black Man, Stevie Wonder, and they read through the lyrics. And then I use the poem A White Man's Burden, and we compare the two.
That's good.
We're trying.
Yeah. Questions, comments? Not speeches, but questions and comments. Ted.
Thank you. Great conversation. You have the word teaching in your book title. Teaching white supremacy was a problem, but teaching has also helped us. And we're in the middle of a really weird week with the Supreme Court.
Yep.
Seeming like it's, from early reporting, going to overturn affirmative action and Harvard specifically. So what are your early reactions to this landmark decision that's probably coming? I hope it isn't, but it might be. And it's off topic, but it's so important.
You want to?
No, after you.
Well, I have, I think like most of us here, disturbed by this, and I think it will get worse before it gets better. And I'm sure that Harvard and Chapel Hill and other schools and a lot of other politicians will rail against this with good reason. I'm also sure that Harvard, being what it is, will find a way around it. And like most universities, will find a way around this. However, that's less, in some ways, that's less important than the fact that this is becoming accepted political ideology in the United States. It's devastating. And to have studied and witnessed the struggle for so long and to see this reversal at this point is, and I had this conversation with so many of my colleagues, deeply, deeply painful and disappointing. On the other hand, Barack Obama was elected. And so I see reason for optimism over the long term. And of course, part of the reason why we're seeing this reaction is that a lot of people are well aware that within 30, 40 years, people of European descent will be just one more minority. That's sparking this. We have to learn to live by that last phrase of the Pledge of Allegiance, which to me is fabulous. And I'm not threatened by it by any means. It seems like an enormous accomplishment that so many people from so many different backgrounds could live together and succeed and build a terrific country. The possibility of that is so inspiring, but it also clearly is stoking such fear. We're going to be at this for a while. Yeah.
Okay.
How do you feel, or should I say, how do you think we could expose more of meetings like this, or of talks like this, to bridge together? It does. I think it's going to be hard, but do you think there is a way to do it, other than what we're seeing on TV, to where, I've watched a particular show where they're promoting a book, but they don't want to tell the truth about what happened, on January 6th. So do you think a bridging could happen? Because I don't want to have a long fight with this, of our atmosphere of today.
Thank you. Don?
Yeah, I'm an historian. I can tell you about the past. I don't know what will happen. But as I alluded to before, I think we're in for a very long struggle. I do think there is every possibility of some real serious violence. But we've seen that before. It's been worse. Read chapter 6 in the 1920s. You'll see how much worse it could have been.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are we out of time for questions? Do we have time for one more, or are we out of time? Okay.
Hello. I am horrified by things you've said. I think it's wonderful that you're trying to spread the blame, not just, so many people blame the South and not the North. And I have to say that it's a horrible, disgusting thing to say, but every day I wake up thinking, thank God I wasn't born black in America. Mm-hmm. And I think that I lived in Sweden, I lived in Prague, I've lived in Europe, and there's none of this. And how could Americans be so different? I really don't think there's this kind of prejudice in Europe. And I don't know about Asia or other places, I haven't been there. But I'm also discouraged about what you said about Emerson, and I remember when I learned about Lincoln, that Lincoln was not always such a fine guy either. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that he really wanted all blacks to go back to Liberia.
Oh, he was a lifelong colonizationist as well.
Yeah, he
at
wanted
the
that.
middle of his first term.
Yeah, and when he knew he had to win the Civil War and have black soldiers too, he evolved, and some men evolve. Thank God some men evolve. But I'm saying that also, this is something that I just want to ask this, and this is maybe very controversial and very politically incorrect, but a lot of my friends, when I say, they say, oh, talk about slavery and all this stuff, we're in America, we had a black president, get over it. And I say, and then they also say to me, what about the black people in Africa that sold black men to these slaveholders? They bear some responsibility too. Yeah. We are really bad, but come on, is there this hierarchy in black society in Africa too? Is this something warped about human nature, or I just wonder what you think about this?
Yeah, we don't have a monopoly on evil. Sorry. No.
But I think you're a bit too romantic when you're talking about if I understood you correctly, to be suggesting the absence of racism in Europe. That's not true. They're not enough black people, right? They're more. If you ask Algerians in Paris, they would tell you a different.
I believe that, but I lived in Sweet Stockholm in the mid-'80s, and so one black person on the street, everybody looked, and everybody was so excited.
Yeah, but if he'd brought his neighborhood, it would have been a whole different thing, right?
Well, I want to thank our speakers very much and thank our audience.